Hey YouTube, today I brought Dr. Tim Schroeder. He's a professional philosopher from Rice University. I believe he's the department chair. And thanks for coming on. We're excited. Could you
Thanks
tell
for
us
having me.
about yourself, about how you got interested in philosophy, what you're doing right now? That'd be great.
Yeah, when I got to college, I thought I was going to be a physics major, probably, and I took college physics and college math to start on that path, and I discovered that being a good high school math student isn't being a good college math student. And I really felt like, oh, geez, I've like hit my ceiling for math where I can work comfortably. Like maybe I could grind out something, but things stopped being intuitive. But I went to not very distinguished, but liberal arts oriented college. So I was taking a lot of other courses at the same time. And one of them was philosophy. Why was it philosophy? It's because psych was full. And that's how like mundane and boring the story was. But in that philosophy class, I was like, wow, there's a whole field where people think the way I like to think. I didn't know that was something you were supposed to do. I thought it was just an annoying tick that I had. And so for a while I told myself, well, I'm just fooling around with philosophy, but my true love is physics. And then pretty quickly it turned out, no, I'm going to double major philosophy and physics. That's the best way to go, because that will allow me to address like the questions that I feel most excited about as physics questions. And then it turned out, no, the physics was all done almost from the start. And the thing I should really do is be a philosopher.
Awesome.
So that was what, 89 to 93 in a small college in Canada, the University of Lethbridge. And from there, I was lucky I got into a PhD program at Stanford. And that was an awesome experience for me, especially because I was leaving a town of 60,000 in the Canadian prairies. And I was going to one of the most beautiful places in North America, and a place where, everybody loved school pretty much. And I was full of this excitement of, learning. And I was the last person admitted in my year. Right, and they got pretty deep into the admissions pool before they got to me too. I had some inside gossip, and I felt so privileged to be there, and I was super privileged to be there, and everybody was smarter than me. People say it always feels like everybody's smarter than you. Almost everybody clearly was smarter than me, but I just took to it and just sort of jumped in with both feet, and I think I actually got smarter. I'm still not that smart, but I got a lot smarter starting then, and it was so awesome. Had a first job at the University of Manitoba, second job at Ohio State, and now I'm at Rice.
Nice. So your initial interest was physics, psychology. So does that play into what you're into now in terms of what you specialize in philosophy?
Not really. I always liked natural science. I was always a natural science enthusiast. The 12-year-old watching Nova specials on PBS, but I didn't have a special idea about what kind of philosophy I should do, except that I should try to find something where I'm kind of good at it, and not struggle to do things that I'm not that good at. I thought maybe something in the theory of knowledge would be exciting, and I asked Fred Dretsky one summer. He was at Stanford at the time, and I asked him, hey, would you do a directed reading with me on epistemology this summer? He said, sure. He was super nice and affable. And about halfway through it, he said, Tim, if you want to keep doing this stuff, that's totally fine. But right now I'm writing a book on consciousness. How'd you like to do that instead? I said, yes, sir. Yes, sir, whatever you want. I was in awe of Fred. He was so awesome to me. And so then I started reading stuff about consciousness. I got really excited. I read Dan Dennett's Consciousness Explained, which is a great book to get you excited about philosophy of mind and about the interdisciplinary study of the mind, bringing in psychology, bringing in neuroscience and linguistics. And that just really fired me up. And Fred said, that's a good thing to get excited about. But before you're ready to, bring together all these different disciplines, you should probably like settle down and learn something about philosophy first. And that's how I did my dissertation. Over the years, I discovered that the first book that I read when I got to my grad school, I got there a week early. I bought a book from the campus bookstore, and it was Fred Dresky's Explaining Behavior. Over time, I realized like that book imprinted on me. Like I was Descartes' piece of wax, and it was just like, it was stamped into my brain. And really my dissertation project and then my post-dissertation research in other directions, if you knew Explaining Behavior and then you saw my career path, you couldn't be less surprised. But I didn't really realize it for a long time. So that's how I became a philosopher of mind. Again, just like becoming a philosopher, it was kind of a random walk. If I had met somebody else or talked to a different person about an independent study, I could be just about any kind of philosopher. But I feel lucky because the thing that I've tried to do, I've been medium good at doing. And medium good feels like a pretty good accomplishment. I'm happy with that.
And you were just talking about that kind of interdisciplinary action there, right? So some might say, what's the point of philosophy of mind when we have psychology and neuroscience, right? It's just a scientific question. Why is this a philosophical question? And so I would love to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think I'm going to say something not super original amongst professional philosophers, but it's maybe helpful. If you're a scientist and you're studying consciousness, a neuroscientist or a psychologist, you can feel pretty good about using scientific tools to get a better and better understanding of what has to be going on in a human brain for consciousness to happen. And at the same time, what you don't normally feel you're getting closer and closer to, or if you do feel like it, you're going out on an unscientific limb, is explaining why that stuff counts as consciousness. So, I mean, you can say, well, like, for instance, I know why it's reportable, because neural activity here has to have these features in order for it to drive the neural activity that controls your mouth. That's a minimal condition on you being able to talk about that other neural activity. So we can say, like, what makes it something reportable, or what makes it something that you can act on. But of course, we know that your body can move in ways that are not driven by your consciousness. In a very boring way, like when you're asleep, your heart beats and your lungs breathe. That's driven by your brain. In a less boring way, there are eye blink reflexes that are triggered by things that can be outside of consciousness. There are brain level reflexes driven by things independently of consciousness. There's the drift of your unconscious associations and all of that stuff. So, like, we know that stuff has to be a certain way in order to control certain kinds of movement, but we don't know, like, why some of that stuff should be counted as conscious, like why consciousness makes sense. You could say, look, I have a complexly moving organism right next to me right now outside my window. It's a tree. I'm pretty sure that's not conscious, but it is complexly moving. But it's not like complexly moving the way that I complexly move. It's a different kind of complex moving. So why does this kind of complex moving count as conscious and that kind doesn't? Like, once you're asking questions like that, you're asking questions that can't be answered with an experiment. I mean, you can experimentally show how different the tree is, but you can't show experimentally why one of those differences is the difference that conceptually requires consciousness exists. You have to think clearly about your concepts to do that. And that's the thing that philosophers are specialized in. We're definitely not the only people who think clearly about our concepts. And lots of psychologists and neuroscientists have interesting ideas about consciousness because they all think those thoughts too. But it's the job of our discipline to be good at that. And especially to keep track of all the dumb ideas that we came up with and figured out why they were dumb and discarded. And to keep like a giant heap over on one side and not forget about the heap. And if you want to retrieve something from the heap, to at least remember why it was discarded there in the first place. And so we're really good at keeping that living tradition alive of trying to work out these conceptual problems, or these problems that are just a matter of thinking clearly about your topic. And whatever progress we make it by being good at that. And that's a tool that eventually you might need as a scientist. Consciousness is a really easy example, but I'll give you just one more super quick one. Like, think about studying love. Suppose that you wanted to study love. Lots of psychologists do, some neuroscientists do. You should probably have an idea of what you're studying. You should probably choose to study one phenomenon, not a bunch of phenomena. You should, if you are going to operationalize love, as they like to say, meaning you're going to say, okay, this counts as love for our purpose. You should, if you really want to study love and not only something tangentially associated with it, you should probably pick that pretty carefully, right? Like, for instance, if you're like, oh, I'm interested in love, I'm not interested in infatuation, you had better stop for a second and think, what is the difference between love and infatuation? And you can't do an experiment to tell you what the difference is. And you can't look in a dictionary to tell you what the difference is. I mean, a dictionary is just philosophy done by a lexicographer, basically. It's only a starting point. It's certainly not a guarantee. And then you have to be like, well, what do I think the difference is between infatuation and actual love? And as soon as you've done that, you started doing philosophy.
Interesting. So there are a lot of relationships that past philosophers have given between a brain state, a mental state, or the brain and the mind. It goes from, look, they're just totally separate, right? You know, the brain, it goes as far as reflexes, and that's as much as we can say about it. There are ones that then go all the way on the other end and make a strong identity claim. And there's sort of these weird in between. There's the idea of a supervenience, which is not quite that kind of identity relation that that you would get. And there's also a sense of dependence also, here, where like, and I was wondering if you could kind of go over maybe what some of those relationships that philosophers have given to the mind and the brain, and then maybe give us what you think is most plausible kind of relation.
Some of that stuff sounded like a little bit in the weeds. I feel like it's a little hard to believe anybody but a philosopher really cares about some of those fine distinctions. But you know, here's a really easy starting point. You can say, okay, let's say we can either be some kind of materialist or not. You can think there's an immaterial soul or something, or there isn't. I think the evidence against an immaterial soul, at least one that makes any difference to what I say or think or do, or how I feel or what I see, is pretty weak. So I'm going to start off as a materialist. If you start off as a materialist, then the easiest position to take is just, well, your mind is your brain. But it can't be first all of your brain. Like, you know, there's some parts of your brain that are involved in making your heart beat. Like, that's not my mind. It's not like my choice or what I want. All right. And then you could say, well, you could still have your brain even if all the neurons stopped firing, but you wouldn't have your mind even if all your neurons stopped firing. So you have to say, okay, so some of my brain, and it's the operations of some of my brain that make up what the activities of my mind. And then the ability to engage in those activities, this also my abilities to engage in those mental operations, like thinking and feeling and seeing and making a choice and making a plan, talking to myself. Okay, but then you think, could all of that stuff be done without a brain? Or would you have to have a brain to do it? I kind of think that you could in principle do that stuff without a brain. Just for the narrowest thought experiment, imagine that you replaced neurons with, you know, electronic circuitry that worked exactly the way the neuron does, right? So it integrates signals coming from dozens to hundreds of inputs, like dendrites, and then it integrates them on some formula, and that formula is a changeable formula, and then it outputs a signal to some limited dozens or hundreds of targets, like an axon does. If you did that, it would be really hard to believe that the replacement electronic being didn't have a mind. First, it would act and talk like somebody who did. Second, it would be really hard to formulate what it was about your stuff being squishy and that other stuff not being squishy that could possibly matter. And so my view is something like this. You wouldn't quite say that a mind in general is the same thing as the relevant part of your brain's activity in general. I would say, like, that's my mind, that's my brain's activity, but somebody else's mind could be somebody else's electronic circuit activity. And then for all I know, as a fan of classic Star Trek, maybe there's a way of like being a colored ball of energy that somehow allows you to have a mind. It doesn't seem very likely, but I don't know, the universe is big. So that makes me what philosophers like to call a kind of functionalist. I think if you have the right organization, then you have a mind. Our brains have that right organization. That's why we have minds. But you might not need to have a brain to have that kind of organization. Maybe something else could have that organization. And then that other thing could have a mind too. But I'm not a really liberal functionalist in the sense that I don't think anything with the same broad input-output patterns gives you a mind. I think the internal details matter too. So that's me on that, but I haven't really done anything to justify that except sort of walk you through how I got to where I am.
I see. And inevitably, when you study the mind, you run into other areas in philosophy. One of the biggest is free will, determinism, and then of course morality, right? So I was wondering, is it kind of an inevitable thing to address in the philosophy of mind to discuss those sorts of issues? And have you?
I don't think it's inevitable because you can be a specialist of a really narrow thing or a really big thing that only tangentially touches, and you can just say, oh, I don't know what the result is, but I'm pretty happy over here. But I agree that in principle, in the long term, in philosophy, you're trying to solve all problems simultaneously. And if you think you're making a lot of great progress on free will, and it implies that you should be thinking about the mind in a certain way, philosophers of mind should care. And likewise, if you're making really good progress in philosophy of mind, and it seems to imply a certain way of thinking about free will theorists should care. But we don't make progress so fast that we really strongly constrain each other, but it like weakly constrain each other. I got interested in free will. That was really the topic of the first paper I ever wrote. I co-wrote it with a friend in grad school, and then we are Poly. And over time, I kind of ended up thinking something like this. The most important thing to me when I think about free will these days is I want it to be true that I take my own actions for my own reasons. And I think, what has to be true for me to take my own actions for my own reasons? And I think the main thing I think is, like, if my reasons for doing something are like to help somebody because I love somebody, maybe it's like selfish. I want to be the winner. I want to have high status. Or maybe it's just general goodwill, like it would be nice to take care of the environment. Or maybe it's something super idiosyncratic, like I'm a Canadian. I just like things to go well in Canada. I'm for that. Whatever it is, if those are the kinds of things that are reasons for me to do stuff, then I want those kinds of reasons to be my reasons why I do the things that I do. Like if I make coffee for my wife, I want it to be because like I want to take care of her and I love her. And coffee is one of the things in the morning that helps take care of her and show I love her. Well, so what needs to be true for that? I think what needs to be true is that my caring about my wife, my loving her, my wanting her to have coffee, my thinking that that's a good way of taking care of her, all of those things have to cause me, pouring the hot water and pressing the French press and pouring out the coffee after 4 minutes, blah, 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 blah. It has to cause that stuff. If it doesn't cause that stuff, then whatever my body is doing, it's not doing it for my reasons. So that's the most important thing to me. And I think that doesn't require any kind of, wiggle room in the universe of cause and effect. So if you think that free will is all about having wiggle room in the universe, then I'd say, I don't want that kind of free will. I don't want there to be wiggles that come in between me loving my wife and my actions to take care of her. I don't want there to be any wiggles that come in between me loving the country where I was born and grew up and me going, yeah, if Canada wins a major hockey game against the US. So if that's free will, I don't want it. But maybe free will is just being able to do stuff for your own reasons. And in that case, I have it. But in that case, also, it's a lot easier to have free will than I would have thought, like when I was 18 and thinking about that stuff.
Seems like it's compatible with determinism then, right? So you would be some kind of compatibilist. So the fact that there's some antecedent conditions for your reasons is not going to undermine the fact that your free action, that your action was free because those were your reasons, right?
That's how I think about it. Like, suppose somebody said, oh, I can causally explain how you came to love the person that you then married. I'm like, I think I could causally explain it too. I'm a theorist of desire. Like I think I have some good tools, but I'm sure other people could too. And maybe I missed some stuff. I'm sure I missed some stuff. And maybe you could point that stuff out to me. Maybe even some of it would be embarrassing. Oh, did you ever notice that your spouse looks a little bit like your mom did when your mom was about that age? I'm like, oh, geez, I never thought of that until after we got married. But then I did kind of notice there's a little bit. Maybe that had something to do with it. Does that make me feel bad about loving my spouse? No, it doesn't. It doesn't make me embarrassed in the least. If you can say, oh, I can like show you how the universe arranged for you these things to matter to you, I'll be like, okay, fine. But did the universe outside of it mattering to me move my arm? Or did the the part of the universe that I care about, which is like my mind, it mattering to me, is that the part that moved my arm? If that's the part that moved my arm because it mattered to me, that's all I really want. I mean, it would be, I guess, nice in some sense to be able to say, oh, like I'm a thing that stands back from all of my own reasons and can pick which reasons I have. But what reason would I have to pick one reason over another? I think that's kind of incoherent.
It almost sounds like it would end up with infinite regress too, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But so that brings us to one of the things that you really emphasize in your writing. You've written many papers about it. You've written a book called "In Praise of Desire," right? And you go at it, right? You try to define or try to give us an account of desire. So, what is a desire? I guess we could start with: do you think desires are beliefs?
Yeah, I don't think so. I should firstly say I wrote In Praise of Desire with Nomi Arpali, with the same friend from grad school that we wrote about free will together. And we've written off and on together. She's really an ethicist. And I started as purely a philosopher of mind, but then became a philosopher of mind who cared about desire. And after a while, I discovered if you're a philosopher of mind who cares about desire, the only people who care about desire are ethicists. So you have to go talk to them if you want anybody to care about your own work. So I kind of found myself orienting towards ethics over time. But so the
question was, I guess the first part is what is a desire, but the kind of follow-up question was, do you think it's a belief?
So let me take the second one first, because I was thinking that's the thing I definitely don't think is true. I think that like that's the reason first that we have two separate words, but also that we have such very different ideas about the like paradigms. So when you have a desire, it would be what, like to have some food, maybe for us to have sex with somebody. Maybe it would be a desire that your team wins the game, or a desire that the mob doesn't start rioting. Desire that your country survive the next election, etc. Well, stuff like that. It seems like that stuff in the first instance seems like it's very visceral. It's stuff that like powerfully drives your feelings, drives what you feel like doing. It's not really an intellectual cognition like, it would be bad if my country were destroyed. It would be unfortunate if the mob were to rampage. It would be something I certainly approve of, but that would disappoint others if the Canadian team would win the hockey game. You know, like that's what our paradigms of belief are like, having these ideas and opinions and theories about how things are in the world. That's not really why we have the category of desire in our own thinking. We think about the world as being full of people who want things, because that seems like a different cluster of a person's personality to explain how the person is driven to feel or driven to act. So the way I ended up thinking about desire is something like this. Instead of trying to figure out desire entirely from the armchair, maybe we should think of desire the way that we thought of water, or say earth, air, or fire, like the classic elements, according to some ancient Greeks, amongst others. We should think these are categories that we think about the world. We use to think about the world: desire, belief. Maybe we should just say, well, desires are the things, whatever scientists ultimately discover them to be, that are responsible for all of the things that we associate with them, that are responsible for people, feeling highly motivated, being highly motivated to get food and feeling it, and feeling bad when they're deprived of food, and feeling good when they get it. And likewise, that makes people motivated to cheer on their favorite sports teams, and makes them feel good when their teams win and bad when they don't, motivates them to pay attention to whether or not they won, leaves them dwelling after the fact on happy victories and sad defeats, and all of that stuff. And say, like, desires are just whatever does that. Just like water is this stuff, whatever that stuff turns out to be, that we need to drink, and it rains out of the sky, and it collects in lakes and oceans, and it freezes at one temperature and it boils at another temperature. When it freezes, it expands. That's kind of odd. That's cool. And so on. Then we found out, like, what does that for water is weirdly a molecule that combines an atom that's the kind of thing that we need to breathe, and combines another pair of atoms which themselves would form an explosive gas. You might say, that doesn't sound like water. You're right, it doesn't sound anything like water. The combination of a gas we need to breathe to live and an explosive gas, like, that doesn't sound the least bit like water. You couldn't have figured that out as a philosopher. But you could have figured out as a philosopher, well, water is the stuff that scientists will figure out, whatever that stuff is, that's responsible for all of these effects. And that's the way I ended up thinking about desires too. Desires are the things that scientists can discover that are responsible for all these effects. And then when you look inside the heads of creatures like us, mammals at least, you see there is something that's responsible for all of those effects. And it's a kind of unconscious learning system, the reward and punishment learning system. At least that would be my view. That's definitely still active, controversial research. But that's your desires, because it's that system that both explains why you're motivated to do the stuff that you're motivated to do, and it explains why it is that you feel the way that you do about that stuff, and it explains why it is that you pay attention the way you do, and dwell on and daydream about that stuff. It explains the whole shebang that we associate. And it embraces outlier cases, like wanting to do something that you think is bad or shameful, or you wish you didn't, and not feeling motivated to do and not feeling excited to do the things you think are good and ought to be a source of pride for you and ought to get you up and out of bed. When you think about desires in this way, you can also explain what the relation is, say, of habit to desire. You have a nice scientific explanation of that relationship. You don't just have to armchair it out. A nice scientific explanation, not an armchair explanation, of how it is that caring about a topic helps you learn faster about the topic, or being invested in a skill makes you faster to acquire the skill than if it's just something you gotta do. Like everybody in high school is supposed to master that skill. You have to grind it out to at least a minimal level to pass. Or even how it is that you come into the world pretty much only wanting, to be fed and held, to be warm, to not be poked with sharp things or have super loud noises suddenly turned on around you. And how it is over time that you end up wanting a lot of other stuff, like victory for Canadian hockey teams, or to appear on podcasts.
So I have a lot of questions here. Do you distinguish an intention? So some people say, this could be just a semantic issue here, but if like I intended to do X, does that imply a desire analytically, or does it does it imply a desire like ontologically? I was wondering if you could speak to that.
I don't really know how to think about intentions or plans. Like, can you make a plan to do something that you really don't want to do, and you see the case for doing it? So you figure out like all the steps you need to do, and you kind of lock them in some sense. And then when the time comes, you're just as unmotivated to do it, and you just don't do it. Does that count as having a plan? Like, suppose that I think that I ought to do the right thing. I think that the right thing includes, say, ceasing to consume alcohol. Maybe I was raised in a religious tradition, for instance, that says that consuming alcohol is just a wrong act. Or maybe it's wrong because it's a defilement of the temple of your body. And so I'm like, well, you know, I've been enjoying consuming alcoholic drinks for a while, but I always kind of feel guilty about it. Maybe it's time for me to just like make a plan to stop. It really is the right thing to do. And then I think, all right, well, how should I approach it? Well, let's pick a cold turkey date that won't be too hard to keep, and I should tell some people that I'm going to do it so that I stay committed. You're like, okay, so you work it out. And then you never do any of that stuff, because even though you think that it's wrong to drink, you don't really care. You're not very invested. Every once in a while, you feel a little bit ashamed of yourself, but mostly you just don't think about it. And mostly you just want to drink sometimes and get on with it. Then maybe like you formed a plan and you never wanted to carry out the plan. Maybe.
Interesting. Yeah, I don't have a...
But here's what I would say at this point. At this point, whether or not I really formed a plan now has become just a matter of like, what's the clearest way of thinking about what counts as a plan? I don't consider myself to be especially good at that. Ask Michael Bratman what's a plan. It's just a philosopher that I would pick for that purpose. Also a Stanfordite. Also super good teacher, by the way. But I would say it's definitely different from wanting something, both because you can definitely work through that mental process without wanting the outcome, and also because you can want outcomes and never plan on attaining them. You think it's unrealistic, or you just know that it's basically out of your hands, or you are embarrassed to want that thing, and so you always turn your mind away from making plans around it, even though you do in fact want it. So I think there's a strong separation of some kind, and then exactly what the kind is, I wouldn't be so sure. Are you really into the connection between plans and desires?
Well, I take, if you take certain, like a view of desire in terms of like commitments, then I don't really see I don't see how to distinguish a commitment and a plan.
Yeah.
The idea of like planning for the future, the idea of like, oh, I have some commitment for the future. Well, it just could be that your commitments change, and then what sort of reason giving does that past event have on that current event? I don't, you know, there's that, but there's like some people use intention very generically, and they do want to distinguish, like, yeah, I just simply intended to lift my right hand. I think what they mean there is what you would mean by I wanted to raise my right hand. And then there's a sort of I intend to get a degree in philosophy, right? That's the sort of plan, and I think that is markedly different. But I wanted to, if you wanted to speak to that, that's fine. But I'm very interested in your the reward punish construal of desire.
Yeah.
Do you just take reward and punish to be different from success or failure? Because I could want to raise my right hand, but you know, I could get a pinched nerve at that very moment, and it seems like I fail, right? And so, is that what you would say? I mean, it kind of like if you could relate the success failure distinction with with relation to wanting or desiring and maybe reward and punishing, that would be great.
So now I'm going to tell you what I think as a theorist, but if you want to like push around with examples, then we can get to how I came to be this kind of theorist. But I would say a reward for you is something that you want for itself. So maybe or at least to say it's something like this: what makes something a reward for you is that it is, or it instantiates or guarantees something like that, something that you want for itself. And a punishment is something that you're averse to in itself, or that is, you want not to be the case for itself. And some rewards and punishments we're aware of, and some we're not. The only ones that can affect us psychologically through reward and punishment learning are the ones that we become aware of in some way. Even if aware here just means like unconsciously detect. But, you know, I could be punished for being a belligerent speaker at a conference by somebody else at the conference deciding not to, you know, shortlist me for a job. And they're like, didn't seem okay, but he was kind of a jerk today. I don't need a colleague like that. So that's the punishment for me. I got punished for being a jerk at the conference, but I didn't become aware of it. It didn't affect me psychologically. Maybe over time, I would like retrospectively look back. Why did people shun me more and more the more I was talking? Maybe it's because I'm like a rude little dick when I talk. Maybe I should like work on that. But you know, at the time, the punishment happens. Nothing happens. Likewise, I can be rewarded in exactly the same way. I can be rewarded for being like a thoughtful, sympathetic interlocutor by somebody hearing me be such and think, huh, Tim might actually be a pretty good colleague to have. Maybe I should mention him for the short list for the job that we're running. If that would contribute to something that I want, then that would be being rewarded for that, even though I might be totally unwitting of being rewarded for it. But when it makes a difference to your psychology, obviously, you detect these things. So you get the food that you want. That's a reward. That's classic behaviorist. Rats get cheese rewards. But then there's also all of the stuff that goes into child rearing or that goes into education, right? So why do good teachers take a, you know, an insightful student answer and make a big fuss out of it, right? And say like, yes, exactly, you've totally nailed it. So, you know, we were trying to figure out this, and here Evelyn intervenes and she's got this idea and she nails it. You're like, you're trying to change the way Evelyn's mind works by rewarding her. You wouldn't necessarily be self-consciously trying to reward her. You don't necessarily think like a behaviorist, but you're like, you're trying to encourage her to make these kinds of insightful leaps again in the future. And it's not like you're just trying to give her an incentive structure. Like if you make n insightful leaps, I will like shower you with praise in class. You're trying to actually change the way her mind works to make her like more naturally prone to insightful philosophical thoughts.
Yeah, so I see that when you recognize that you failed, like if I desired X and I failed to get X, seems like I have this drive to correct myself, right? Maybe punishment has something to do with that as well. And what you were saying earlier, that if you don't recognize the failure, there's not there. But you're saying there's still a sense in which you're being punished, right? So I think that might be a way in which we distinguish failure and punishment, or maybe that the way that they're related.
You know, sometimes failure is no punishment at all because you only failed in like the intermediate, right? So suppose that there's somebody of a sex that you find attractive and you're trying to impress the person. You're like, I'm going to walk over and make a witty observation about the thing that's happening over here. And you walk over and you completely botch the witty observation. Right? You just like mumble it and stammer it and you get the word wrong at the wrong point and you like put the order wrong and you just completely humiliate yourself. And by completely humiliating yourself, you endear yourself to this attractive person who then begins to have a conversation with you. And then you're not punished at all for that, because you only wanted to say those things to initiate a conversation with this person on favorable terms, hoping that, maybe the two of you would be interested in each other or like each other or whatever. So you still got the thing you wanted. You weren't punished at all. Some part of you changes as a result of your verbal stumblings. It's your cerebellum. It's got the job of just sort of making sure that your short-term motor plans are executed successfully. And if you make a hash of it, it'll like retrain itself to make it less likely that you'll make a hash of it next time. But as far as reward and punishment goes, you're rewarded for that. You might unconsciously over time turn yourself into an early rom-com Hugh Grant character, right? He's kind of always sort of awkwardly bumbling and fussing himself into situations because unconsciously it's working for you. It's endearing people to you. Ideally, that wouldn't be endearing in the long term for everybody, but as a persona, it worked really well for Hugh Grant as an actor for quite a while. So maybe it works for some people that way. What you're like immediately trying to do is usually something that doesn't matter in itself for you. It matters in itself because of the implications. Because it's
Can we discuss that in itself?
else.
I would like to. I mean, the in itself, because I'm like getting PTSD from Kant right here. So like, is that the same sense? Like that there's something in itself, like a good in itself, like something intrinsic good. That is it.
Yeah.
Help me there.
Like, there's nothing morally good in itself about giving a hungry person $20. Like, for instance, suppose that society broke down the other day and nobody's taking money anymore. You giving a hungry person $20 doesn't help the person at all. Likewise, if you give the hungry person $20, but you're both like stranded on a desert island and you are looking at starvation before leaving the island, it's not helping the person in any way at all. Normally, you think it's good to give a hungry person $20 because you think this is a tool to make you not hungry. That's what's really good. Or to make you not suffer, or to make you in control of your life, or to empower you. It's hard to say like what the basic moral goods are, but like there are things in that neighborhood. They're definitely not just things like I happen to hold a piece of paper certified by the Treasury when it was issued. So they're the things that you think are morally good because of what they achieve, and then there are the things that are morally good in themselves. Likewise, there are the things that you want because they help you achieve something else, and there are the things that you want in themselves. I want my dad to be healthy and be happy in his old age because I love him. That's just like definitionally true. Like my love of him is in part my wanting him to be healthy and happy. You could say his being healthy and happy is useful to me in a sense. Like if he weren't, I would fly up to Canada more or, worry more. But I just want it so that he's healthy and happy. That's the main thing. On the other hand, I want him to like take a certain arthritis medication. I won't advertise it, but like there's a specific one that's been really good for him. I want him to take it, but I don't want him to take it just so that he's taking it. Like if his condition would somehow change and he wouldn't need the medication, I wouldn't be like, but Dad, you still got to be taking the medication. Like that stuff, like I'm just really into you taking it. That would be absurd, right? I only want him to take that stuff so that he'll be healthy and happy. So likewise, everything that we want, you can ask, do you really want that? Or do you just want it for something else?
And this kind of reminded me, if someone took your view of desire as being not a belief, and let's say they also took a kind of subjectivist view, maybe an unsophisticated one in which, the good is just what I desire. Do you think that would make them a non-cognitivist about the good?
Doesn't sound like it. I mean, you have to have some capacity to represent the good in order for you to desire it, right? To give a content to your desire. So if you can conceptualize it as the good, there you go. That has a referential content. It's either an empty referential content, if there is no such thing as what's good, or it refers to the good, if there is such a thing as what's good.
So by saying I desire X, that's a belief, but the desire itself is not.
If I believe that I desire something, that's right, that's a belief.
Okay.
And then if I want it, that's a desire.
Okay. So it's not true or false that I want something then? I mean, because when I'm thinking of either...
My want isn't true or false. My want is satisfied or not satisfied.
Okay.
That I want something. That proposition can be true or false. Also, the thing that the proposition that is wanted to be the case can be satisfied or unsatisfied. Like that Montreal win the Stanley Cup. That proposition can be satisfied or unsatisfied, true or false.
And so your view is compatible with a kind of cognitivism, right? And for the viewers, there's some people.
No. Well, what kind of cognitivism? There are many, many cognitivisms.
Okay. I guess the idea that moral proposition or that moral statements are propositional or.
Oh yeah. No, I think that. I think most moral statements are true or false in the very straightforward, boring way, and you don't have to go through any kind of weird convolutions to defend that. And I think that people contingently care about morality. And the people who do care about it are morally better than the people who don't. The people who act in conformity to it have done right, and the people who don't have done wrong. But I think that your motivation to do that and you're feeling good about doing it is contingent on you wanting to do that stuff.
And so one of the distinctions you have, like in the very intro portion of your book, is the distinction between reason and appetite. And I've heard such distinctions, like maybe if you're a Christian might distinguish, I think in their text, like the spirit and the flesh, right? And maybe that's related, but that kind of gets at what we're talking about. And I've heard also, like I think I don't know if you know Dr. Akil Bilgrami, who's at Columbia University. I think he mentions a similar distinction. I mean, there's a big historical distinction, but I think the term that he uses is something like my reflective faculty and my perceptual faculty. And so you take the side of appetite. And so maybe if you could really outline that distinction and then what it means to say that I take the side of one over the other, I guess. That'd be great.
Yeah. There's definitely something to be said about how people are different from other mammals, and something to be said about how that is definitely related to our being like super intellectually capable in ways that other mammals are not. That's definitely true. One way of theorizing that is to say with some thinkers that we have a sort of like an animal mind that has its own goals, its own drives, its own ability to push our bodies or push our feelings around. And then on top of that, we have like a distinct human set of goals or drives or chosen ends, intentions, purposes, judgments about what's good, something like that. And then those two are both kind of mind-like, and they can push in different directions. You know, Aristotle says that other animals, they perceive and they have ends, but they don't reason. Human beings have that other animal stuff, and on top of it, we have the ability to reason, and our reasoning both can figure out matters of fact, and it can set new goals. And then if the goals that it sets are in conflict, which can happen, with the goals set by the more crude animal capacities, then they just duke it out. When there's a struggle, and either reason wins the struggle and you're embarrassed that there was even a struggle in the first place, or reason loses the struggle and you're embarrassed that you were so weak-willed. So that's one picture. I just don't think that picture is right, because I think that all of the things that other mammals want are like integrated as amongst the things that we want, and all of their abilities to get what they want are integrated into our abilities to get what we want. And all that distinguishes us fundamentally is that we're more conceptually sophisticated. We have a much bigger conceptual repertoire. So we can just understand more about the world. We can understand more cause and effect relations. We can understand more categories of entities. Those categories of entities can be at higher levels of abstraction. So we can just understand more stuff. As a result, we can also want more stuff, including wanting it for its own sake. A rabbit can't want world peace. It's like too conceptually abstract. I can want world peace. It's not because I have a separate kind of faculty. It's just rabbit abstract conceptualization ends somewhere around leafy greens. I don't really know. I don't mean to diminish rabbits if people know better. But you know, like it stops somewhere pretty simple compared to people. With human beings, world peace is only like medium level abstraction. I don't know, cube roots or n-dimensional strings. That's like the upper limit of my abstraction capabilities.
I have much lower limits.
I mean, I'm not saying I can master those ideas, but at least I hear you when you bring them up. Or the other day in class, I was talking about Lao Tzu on presence and absence, being and nothingness, basically. Okay, that's pretty abstract. And the moral stuff that matters to us and seems essential to good human life, all of that stuff is at just a level of abstraction that other animals don't access. Maybe some of it overlaps. Maybe some other animals grasp the idea of pain at a level of abstraction that technically allows them to grasp the idea that other animals than their own species could be in pain. And maybe sometimes they even do grasp that. Sometimes they seem to grasp it and not care about it. There's a cool little finding that Jaak Panksepp, a neuroscientist, once put into a work of his, that it kind of seems like rats have an ultrasonic laugh. Like if you pick it up with ultrasonic recording equipment, it kind of sounds like a little rat laugh, but it's a little hard to tell whether it's a laugh like sound in the way that human laughter is, because if it is a rat laugh, they are really mean. Like when stranger rats are hurt, they laugh. So one possibility is that some other mammals actually have some, only a very small number, but some of the important moral concepts, and they're evil little bastards. But that's the way that I think is the right way to think about the mind, that we don't have kind differences between our minds and other mammal minds. What we have are degree differences in conceptual abstraction. And maybe we have also degree differences in our ability to like visualize and use auditory imagination and search our memories and plan for the future. But you see all those capacities in other mammals anyway. So it's just a difference in degree again.
Yeah. Yeah, I wanted to, so it's for you, look, you're saying something like this, and tell me if I'm getting it wrong, but like, it's not a matter of like, well, there's this part of the brain or this part of the mind and that part, and they do different things, almost like two different persons. But rather it's on a gradient, it's gradential in terms of, you know, the difference between me and my dog would be just how, to what extent I can grasp certain concepts, or how many concepts I have grasped. One of the motivations, though, for me in accepting such a distinction is if you accept something like, I don't know if you're familiar with moral Socratic intellectualism, which is the view that like, if you know the good, you'll do it.
Yeah.
And so I think the idea is that, like, if I take a case where, like the diet case, okay, I'm on a diet. That's my reflective faculty, and that's good, right? But I'm seeing something in front of me that is a cake, and it's making a demand on me, and I feel a tension between two kinds of self, like my rational self and, you know, the beastly self. And so if I end up eating the cake and then I have regret later, I want to say that, well, it wasn't a mistake in the sense that, like, I had most reason or most of a drive to do what I did right then. But what I mean by a mistake is that it is that I wish my reflective person kind of overpowered my perceptual side of myself, right? But so I guess, is there a way to hold to some kind of moral and intellectualist view? Like, how do we make sense of mistakes if it's in each individual case, like we it's just one side, or one, it's just the totality of our mind rather than parts finding each other? I don't know if you understood my question. It was long-winded.
I think there's nothing wrong with having goals that are in conflict and that pushing around different feelings and thoughts in your mind. But let me point out that in your example, you have like a sensory self versus the rational self. But in the modern world, here's an equally likely conflict to arise. It's between the self that has chosen to refrain from further caloric consumption and the self that uses Uber Eats to deliver the same awesome pile of Chinese food that you ordered 3 nights ago and that was so fatty and so delicious. Well, like, that's an intellectual part of yourself. That's not a sensory part of yourself. So now take another conflict, a conflict between the part of yourself that says don't get in trouble and the part of yourself that is incensed at hearing some view expressed in a departmental meeting. And you're like, well, even though this could be bad for my career, I feel like I have to say something. And then you're telling yourself, no, shut up, shut up. And then you break down and say it anyway. Or it goes exactly in the opposite direction. You're afraid of saying something, you want to say something, and you're like, I absolutely have to say something. And then you're too scared to say it. And then you blame yourself afterwards for saying it. All of these breakdowns are possible in different directions with different intellectual goals and different, more shared universal animal goals, being either the thing that pushes you to do what you are trying to refrain from, or restrains you from doing the other thing. Like, all combinations of intellectual and animal are possible in like what we experience as temptation. And you know, it can flip. Think about the person who's got some friends, they've been visiting, now they're going to leave. The person has a crummy hourly job at the mall, and the person's like, well, I should go to my job, but I should like hang out with my friends and just like lie about being sick or something. And then the person's like, well, which is like the person's reason here and which is the person's appetite? Because the person's reason can flip, and what the person feels tempted to do can flip totally independently, right? So the person can be thinking like, I don't owe them anything. Like, they're just an exploitative capitalist system. There's nothing wrong with me staying with my friends, and yet feel compelled to go to work anyway, which is definitely not a bodily compulsion, right? And the same person can like think those thoughts and it can find it convincing and like wholeheartedly stay with only a little bit of pang. The same person can think like, I gotta go to work. Like, it's my shift and they don't have anybody else there without me. And weekly stay anyway and hang out with the friends, constantly thinking, oh, just for another minute and I gotta go, and then never doing it. And the same person can be thinking, oh, I gotta go to work, and then go, and then, you know, feel regret at not having stayed with the friends and feel tempted to go back to the friends. Like, all of that stuff is possible. Your ideas about what's good are never like distinctively the driver's seat, even of reason itself. They're definitely not the driver's seat of like intellectual understanding of the situation or of intellectually set motivation in the sense of like very conceptually sophisticated motivation, like motivation to like not break your word. That's like super abstract and intellectual. And you can be weak-willed in carrying out a commitment to not break your word when you think that you don't owe it to anybody to not break your word. They're just capitalist exploiters, but you have to do it anyway somehow, right? My friend and co-author Nomi, she's especially famous for pointing out how in the moral domain, you can separate what you judge to be right from considerations that actually are the right considerations. But you just don't appreciate that they're right because you're not like a sophisticated moral theorist. You're a bad moral theorist. So she says, Huckleberry Finn in the famous novel by Mark Twain, at some point he thinks he's going to go to hell for helping Jim escape slavery. And it's like, that's because God knows it's wrong to steal Miss Watson's property. That's how he thinks about it. He can't see an overriding moral argument that God could accept for his doing what he's doing. But he also sees, we don't get this spelled out for us because Twain is actually a good novelist, but he sees something about like Jim needing to determine the course of his own life, which also is very important to Huckleberry, even though he's supposed to be a 10-year-old kid, but he's super independent and he like runs his own life, and he sees Jim needs to run his own life, and Jim's just another person. And even though he doesn't think that that makes it right, he's like, I'm going to do it anyway. And he does. He helps Jim anyway. I think the Socratic idea is just first empirically false. Second, like experientially, it doesn't feel true to reality. But then third, it also buys into a really false division between the stuff that is distinctively humanly intellectual, all being on one side, and all the stuff that ever opposes that stuff that supposedly is all on one side, all being on the side that we share with dogs and goats. I think all three of those ideas are mistaken.
So you're saying there's still a sense in which we can talk about the person that is that is, you know, in the diet case, that's looking at that's deliberating about the cake and kind of goes for the cake, and the person that doesn't, that these are two, in a sense, persons that are in conflict. We can talk about that in a meaningful way without bringing in this like this really strong sense of division that Aristotle and Plato were utilizing.
That's right.
Is that how I'm understanding it?
That's right. With the idea that there's an animal self inside you that isn't the human self, and that the two of you can be in tension. I think that's a really bad way of thinking about inner struggle. And the better way of thinking about inner struggle is you just want a lot of things and you can't have them all. And sometimes it's easy to accept that you can't have them all, and sometimes it's not easy at all. And then sometimes you're rational and sometimes you're irrational. And that and ease of acceptance that you can't have everything, those are really orthogonal. And so they allow for all of the different variations, dimensions of variation. Sometimes you struggle to do what's rational. Sometimes you struggle to make yourself do what's irrational. Sometimes doing what's irrational is easy and what's rational is hard. Sometimes what's rational is easy and making yourself do something irrational is hard.
Which we've been sort of talking about it, but to kind of end with in terms of our topics. And so if there's anybody in the chat, y'all could start at Phil Talk if you want to ask him any specific questions about anything that we've discussed. But to sort of end, I wanted to talk about, I think you briefly mentioned inner struggle and how that relates to akrasia and addiction. Now, there's a lot to talk about here, right? I guess we've mentioned, I mean, it seems like if in the case of the diet, the person on the diet, that if they were to eat the cake and then to express regret, well, that's what I want to ask you, right? And let's say they eat the cake and the very next day they don't feel regret, they don't feel like they've done the wrong thing. Is there a sense in which we can say that they were Acratic. And so I do want to ask you that, and maybe before that, could you explain to the viewers what Akrasia is? Because we don't hear that term colloquially at all. It's like I only came across it academically. So if we could talk about that, that'd be great.
Yeah, it comes from ancient Greek philosophy. It's an ancient Greek word. I was taught to pronounce it Akrasia, but it's not super important. Ancient Greek is not a live language. We can only annoy classicists and a handful of philosophers, so it doesn't really matter. Akrasia is given like a discussion that implies a certain set of experiences, and then it's also given like a theoretical statement. So it's like acting contrary to your best judgment. That's like the theoretical statement. You judge that one thing is best, and then you do something else. But then there's also this implication that when you make a best judgment, your best judgment is right and can't be wrong, or at least if somehow you didn't judge especially wisely, it can't be that some other part of you that isn't judging is smarter than your best judgment. Your best judgment, by definition, is supposed to be like the smartest part of you, one most able to appreciate good reasons. And then there's like maybe some other part of you, your lower animal part of you, that pulls you in directions, and then those two might be in conflict. So Nomi has these convincing cases, both in the moral domain, convincing to me, but they got a lot of traction in the literature, in the moral domain, people judging what's right and then being moved by some other consideration. And those other considerations really being the better moral reasons, but the person just isn't a good enough moral theorist to see, oh, these are actually moral reasons, overriding moral reasons. Here's why. So they still think they're doing wrong, but they're virtuous in their action, and they're acting rightly, and they're praiseworthy. But you could say the same thing.
Sorry to interrupt. Is she a virtue? It almost sounded like I'm reading Hursthouse, Rosalind Hursthouse, and a lot of in some of the chapters you dedicate a chapter to virtue. So I didn't know if what y'all worked on was related to virtue ethics or not.
You know, where we're intersecting, we're both doing moral psychology, and moral psychology is not normative theory. So it's not normative virtue ethics. It's not a kind of virtue ethics that tells you what the right and the wrong things to do are, but it is not unrelated, because having a virtue is having a certain kind of mental state, roughly, very crudely. And so if you are trying to understand the human psychological relationship to morality, which is, I think, a decent way of saying what moral psychology is, then you would like to have a discussion of what virtue is, as well as what it is to act for the right reasons, what it is maybe to act for any reason, the origin of moral feelings, the possibility of moral knowledge. You'd like to be able to like discuss all of those kinds of things intelligently as you're doing moral psychology. And so virtue is definitely part of that. And then also same with weakness of will, just as a general phenomenon, and then also specifically as applied to the moral case. You think, oh, I really ought to do something about malarial bednets. They're like such an efficient way of helping people. And I should just like get up $100 and send it off. And then you're like, yeah, maybe later. And then you buy $100 of beer and you haven't done it. And then you're like, I should have done that. So that also is a case of moral akrasia. And then whether or not it really is weakness of will, like the way English uses that phrase, oh, I was so weak-willed. That's its own question. So some smart people like Richard Holton say that if you want to explain what it is when people are talking about, oh, I was so weak-willed, you shouldn't focus on going contrary to what you judge to be best, because there are these cases where the two come apart. Aristotle's theory of the human phenomenon of being subject to temptation and weakness was that it was going against your best judgment, but that's not really the best theory of human weakness. And so then you can say, well, technically, Akrasia is still going against your best judgment because Aristotle's allowed to define it how he wants. And no living Greek speaker is alive to say, that's not what Akrasia really means. Sorry, no living ancient Greek speaker is around for that. And then you can say, but it's not really weakness as we ordinarily think of weakness. And then you can theorize that separately.
And I mean, sometimes when you, this kind of reminded me, going back, I do want to discuss addiction, but are you partial to Nietzsche in terms of understanding human action in terms of drives? And I don't know if you familiar. I mean, if I'm familiar enough to use Nietzsche's exact terminology, but he talks about how human beings have underlying drives or dispositions. Doesn't call. I don't even know what he thinks about virtue, but I was wondering if there was a relation there between your view of desire and the kind of Nietzschean view of human action and will.
I'm pretty ignorant about Nietzsche, but I read a little bit of stuff not so long ago. I don't think there's a super close connection. I think the word drive isn't a very good word for the thing that I think about as our fundamental motivating attitude, which I normally just call desire and sometimes call wanting, and occasionally wishing. If you want something but you don't think you got a reasonable way of doing anything about it, then you just say you wish for it. But if you find a way of doing something about it, then you say you want it. So the reason I don't think that drive is really a good category is that, like, most of the stuff that we want for itself, like as normal people, isn't very drive-like in the sense that it's like accessible to self-reflection, not automatically, but not with a great struggle. Do I love my spouse? Yes. It's not really very hard to figure it out. Is it an expression of like some underlying drive where if the facts that I believe changed, the love would just instantly go away and be diverted to something else? No. Do people by their nature need to be in loving relationships for like 99% of the human species? Probably. But that doesn't really make it a drive. It's just to say that the way that we're constituted, we're born wanting certain kinds of social interactions or things that can only come from social interactions. And that's why we need other people in our lives, that we need, to be held, to share our thoughts, to be understood, human stuff like that, which is all stuff that we want.
The notion of like drive, I guess urge too, really factors into addiction. That someone can have this sense in which they no longer identify that as, that they kind of want to alienate that from themselves, yet it still explains what's their behavior. And so I guess that brings us to addiction, right? I believe, did you write a paper? It had to do with externality and alienation, or alienation and externality,
Yep.
right? Was that related to this, to addiction? I mean, from what I remember when I briefly went over.
Only very loosely.
Okay.
We ended up writing that paper because Harry Frankfurt, who's super brilliant and who actually very generously put up with two punks from Stanford arguing vociferously with him at conferences for a couple of years until we calmed down. He really drove a lot of people's attention to the phenomenon of like feeling like that's not me when you do something, even though technically it's you doing it, clearly, but still feeling alienated from an action. And then the opposite feeling of like feeling like, yeah, I'm doing it. I'm the agent of the action. And it wasn't like theoretically central for him, the category of the feeling of alienation, but it was like a big part of his descriptions of phenomena. And when you'd read them, you'd think about how these people are feeling like, why am I getting so angry? I don't even understand myself. Why can't I shut up? But you're just like berating somebody. And you're having this kind of eerie feeling of like talking to yourself, trying to shut yourself up, but you can't, right? And things like that. People have experiences like these. And then he had a theoretical interest, which he called externality and internality. And that was all about something, something about the structure of your will being something, an action stemming from the sort of the well-structured will or not stemming from it. And he kind of theorized a well-structured will differently over time. But he had like this technical idea of externality. And then he had this ordinary idea of alienation that he didn't use as a theorist, but he used it in his examples. And the point of that paper was just to say, like, the thing Harry is theoretically interested in is not the thing in the examples, the everyday feeling of alienation. It's just a feeling. Sometimes you feel like, that's not really me, and it really isn't you. Like, there are these devices that can force your muscles to contract and relax as a kind of like physiotherapy. And sometimes people subjectively experience them as making them choose to flex and relax their muscles. Like, it feels subjectively like you're doing it, but you're not doing it, the machine's doing it. It doesn't need a neocortex to work. It'll work just fine as long as your spinal cord is intact and you're not dead. But it feels like you're doing it. So, the feeling of non-alienation doesn't guarantee anything. And the feeling of alienation doesn't guarantee anything. Sometimes you feel alienated from something just because you're so surprised, it's so like out of character. Was it really me who said, please pass the salt? Am I becoming a polite American? I know somebody who like said, I was alienated the first time I said, please pass the salt in an ordinary dinner table context, because it was like so weirdly, middle American, and that was never me. And then here I am doing these things. So it's just a feeling, and sometimes it's indicative of something interesting about a situation. Like with addiction, sometimes you're like, is this really me? Why am I still here waiting for the dealer? Why am I not getting out of here? I'm just going to go back to using. Why am I not leaving? What's wrong with me? But often it's not. They're in addiction. People are like, I really shouldn't do this, but it's me choosing to do it. And you might even think like, what's my justification for being here? I don't have a justification. But you don't have that sense of being out of control. You have the sense of being in control, doing something totally stupid.
Yeah, all too often I think of addiction as someone like as that, like that they're not in control. But then of course there are cases in which someone is like, well, yeah, I'm addicted, but I'm totally fine. Not so much because I used to be very into video games and I would play hours, right? Hours and hours, and it was affecting my schoolwork. And and people pointed it out, like, this is a problem, this is an addiction. I'm like, yeah, I know. It's like I didn't feel like I was out of control, but there was a sense in which I wanted to call it addiction. But yeah, but I still, like, I was held responsible. Oh boy, yeah. When I one semester when I brought home the grades, I was definitely held responsible. And call it what you want, addiction, not addiction. You're responsible. So how do you relate certain instances of addiction and responsibility and blame, I suppose?
I ended up thinking about addiction as something that happens to you when there's a substance you consume or a kind of experience that you have, and that incrementally inculcates an irrational tendency to choose it. That maybe has a limit to how strong it can get, but can get meaningfully strong, not just like a very trivially weak irrational tendency to choose. And so there are a bunch of drugs like nicotine and alcohol and cocaine and amphetamines and heroin, blah blah blah, that are famously addictive. And I think they're all addictive in this sense, along with any other sense that you choose, that you think is a sensible way to talk about addiction. But then also, some people's experiences of video games seem like that. Sometimes, like, it seems to be very rational to just play a lot of video games. Life doesn't seem to offer much better, and what your parents need to do to change your behavior is to make a continued life of video games so horrible that, like, by their constant nagging and threatening, that a life of high achievement in grades or volunteer work fighting the pandemic or anything will turn out to be better. But often there is some irrationality to it. Like, well, this was fun, but really I don't need to be doing this for another 8 hours. And then you do it for another 8 hours. And then you're like, why did I do that? Now I'm like totally wrecked and I'm not going to have any sleep. And it wasn't that fun. And I mean, there was like that one moment, like at 2 in the morning, that was fun, but it wasn't worth like all of this. I'm like, you're like, that was dumb. I'm not going to do it again. The next day you do it again. That's a kind of cultivated irrationality that happens sometimes, seemingly, with video games. And then maybe, with other stuff. I don't have deep theories, but gambling would be like the #1 obvious case. And as everybody knows, game designers are now self-consciously making games to work like classic gambling. So if games are addictive, it's because gambling is addictive.
Oh yeah, with like the loot boxes, they make purchases and stuff like that. Yeah, some of those are steadily becoming more illegal as I'm reading about it. But
it sounds good. It's the kind of thing that really ought to be like carefully thought about socially, the way that like slot machines are carefully thought about socially. They're an easy path for some people. We don't really understand why exactly, but they're an easy path for some people to do things that are, even by their own standards of what they're trying to get out of life, dumb for them, but also where the fact that it's dumb and that they can see that it's dumb doesn't mean that they stop doing it. It doesn't mean that you're like a zombie, of course. Like, in any case, when you're acting irrationally, you're still acting. Nobody is like pulling your arm around for you. Your irrational actions are still your actions. If somebody is pulling your arm around for you, or your spinal cord is pulling you around, or some deep brain structure that has nothing to do with your thoughts and feelings, then, that's not addiction, that's something else. That's not action either, though. Action is like when you're doing things for your own reasons, but they might be bad reasons, even like internally, based on like what matters to you, not just because like somebody outside you says that's a bad reason. But like what actually matters to you is being badly served by your dumb choices, but they're still your choices, so you're doing it. So to me, that says the bad things that you do as an addict, they're your choices, but they're not expressive of what matters most to you, because they're bad choices. They're irrational, like by your own standards. If you were doing what did matter most to you, you'd be doing something else. And so that puts you, but then, you could say the same thing about like somebody who like gets too mad at a friend and says something brutally hurtful about like that friend's past romantic relationship. And you're like, oh my gosh, I think I just blew up my friendship because I was just mad in the moment. That was dumb. Why I love my friend more than that. I don't know why I did that. That was not what I should have done. So like that happens too. And the fact that it wasn't addiction, it just illustrates how when you do something dumb, mostly people are mad at you about it. If it was hurtful or wrong, if you broke a promise, if you deprived somebody of something, if you stole something. But also, when people understand, like, that wasn't the ideal expression of what mattered to you at that moment, then that's some basis for forgiveness too. You can say, look, I can give you a bit of slack. I know you were upset, or I didn't realize you hadn't slept for so long. I didn't realize that your parents were like getting on your case constantly because of your constant Fortnite playing, and you were worried about failing, and just it was all piling up on you. Maybe buy me a dinner and a drink, and tell me about what a shit you are, and maybe I'll forgive you. So people have that kind of relationship to ordinary failures of rationality. I think that's what's appropriate for failures of rationality in addiction too, although that's like a special case because it's chronic and it's incrementally built. It's not something that can just be turned off. When people stop being dependent on drugs that they're addicted to. That often helps them because they don't have immediate dependency to deal with, but they're still addicts. They're just abstaining addicts. And they have to do stuff that ordinary people don't have to do to manage their addiction, like to not go back to constant use. Same thing for people who like knock off their behavior for behavioral addictions, like somebody who stops going to play slot machines can still be an addict and has to like manage the person's own behavior to not go back to playing the slots all the time, not betting on horses, not doing all that stuff. And so I think the thing that we should think is something like this. Normally, when we're mad at somebody, we're mad at them for not caring about us, or for not caring about somebody's property or a promise, or we're mad at them because like they hate us, or because they look down on some group of people who are, generally crapped on in society and don't deserve it. Or we're mad at them because they did something out of cruelty, or like just to flex power over somebody helpless. We're like, that's terrible. That's why I'm mad at you. With addicts, like nothing about becoming an addict makes you like more cruel in of itself, but it does make you act as though you care less about other people's feelings and other people's property often.
Right. You see them as almost, you see the kind of like you said something earlier about they're not doing what they want to do in an ultimate sense. And so it seems like when it comes to blame, or at least our attitudes kind of really take that into account when someone does something wrong, or we take to be wrong.
Yeah, that's how
I think.
Yeah, that's how it should go. That if somebody acts like she doesn't care about your feelings because she only cares about getting high, or somebody acts like he doesn't care about his future because all he cares about is video games, that can be an illusion. It's not that she only cares about getting high. It's not that he only cares about video games. It's, like maybe she likes getting high a little too much, or prioritizes it a little too much, or it's a coping strategy for dealing with some other crummy stuff and it's not a good one. But when you're talking about somebody who's an addict, there's a part of the explanation that's just like the drug or the experience got into the person and changed the way the person makes choices to make those choices dumber, but more likely to get the drug, or more likely to get the game, or more likely to get the gambling or whatever. And that part of the person isn't that person deprioritizing, having a productive life, or deprioritizing friendship, or not caring about your money. That part of the person isn't the person's not caring at all, but it looks like not caring. So people are like tempted to like fully condemn, fully blame addicts because it looks like they don't care about important stuff. And then when people understand that there's an addiction there, they can sometimes flip it too far and be like, oh, you have an addiction. You didn't even do it. It was the drug doing it. Often addicts don't feel like that's a helpful way for them to be treated. Often addicts are like, I need you to treat me like I'm making choices, but I need you also to have some patience, but not too much patience. It's a very hard thing, but you have to treat me like a person who's doing stuff, like not just a medical system that we're both hoping if you pour the right drugs and treatment into the medical system, it'll fix it.
Yeah, like a pathogen or something.
Yeah, that's right. Mm-hmm. Like, it's not like I have COVID or HIV. It's like I'm an addict. That's a different thing. There's something about my own choices that are off. But it's, I think, appropriate often to say, yeah, but some of those choices that you made, that doesn't really express who you really are. The difference between doing that and not doing that was made by your addiction. If it weren't for your addiction, you wouldn't have done it. And the addiction isn't you caring less. It's just you choosing what you care less about over things that you care more about. That's what addiction is.
Wow, thanks for that perspective. That really sheds light, because there's always, I teeter-totter between, they have basically a pathogen versus, they're just they're as responsible, as ever. But I wanted to end, there weren't that many questions in the chat, but there was a question because um, I follow Bill Grommy on his sort of dualism. It's not a substance dualism. And so someone wanted to ask what you thought about dualism, because I always talk about it. You started off in the beginning of the video saying, well, there doesn't seem to be good reasons or good evidence for non-naturalism or not materialism. So I kind of start from materialist framework. And so I guess my question is two-part, just to kind of end the stream, right? Number one, are your views really affected by that dialectic, in the sense that, like, let's say dualism was true, would you have to rewrite everything? Or and then I guess that brings into, what do you even think about the view? It is a kind of a fringe view. I think there's like 8 to 12% of philosophers are dualists. Most are physicalist, and a lot of them don't even take a view. But I guess we could end there if you wanted.
Yeah, there are. So one of the ways, maybe the most common way amongst the philosophers I talk to about being a dualist, is to be something like what's called a property dualist. You probably know all of this jargon. You say, like, there's something about the way consciousness, or say the way seeing or hearing, the way it is to me, has a non-physical aspect. And that's the part that makes it really conscious and not just like a behavioral system. And those were the terms in which we were discussing it before. What is it about me that, makes me not just a behavioral system, but a conscious behaving person? And one way of being a dualist is to say there's like some extra feature. It's my consciousness on top of that, on top of the behaving stuff, on top of the mechanics of movement. If you think consciousness really changes, if you think consciousness is not materialist, and you think it changes the way you move, then there's like an incredible scientific revolution coming, because that would totally be detectable. Like, you wouldn't believe the first experiment that seemed to show it. But if you're like, look, all I have to do is make a conscious choice, and I can deflect an electron in the relevant part of my brain in order to change the way that my body moves. Oh, that's detectable. And
that could happen because there's no physical law preventing it, right? Is that kind of what you're saying? That what's to say that couldn't happen even in a physical sense, a physical possibility?
No. I'm saying, like, that is, you could detect violations of physical law. You'd be like, or like ridiculous correlations that were inexplicable by anything other than a new posit of a new force. Like, the only time the electron deflects this way is always and exactly when he says he's going to choose to move his right arm, and then it goes. Like, that's nuts. And then people would start doing stuff like, well, what if we like get a little bit of an electrical force in there, and we start trying to pull on the electron? How hard can we pull on it before it stops him from moving his arm? You could start to measure the force of non-physical free will, if there were such a thing. Which also makes you wonder whether it would really be non-physical, or whether it would just be a new esoteric kind of what's physical, because you could measure its force. So some people think about a dualistic framework like that, the dualistic stuff, consciousness, if there is such a thing, as dualistic consciousness, or dualistic free will, if there is such a thing. They think it makes a difference to how things physically move in the world. Scientists will see that if it's true, and not too long from now. And they'll start to do things like measure how strong those forces are over the physical world. And that will be like amazing, but that'll be just like a mind-blowing revolution. Everything will be back to square one. There's a weaker kind of dualism that some people like, a kind of epiphenomenal dualism that says there's a second thing, not just like the matter described by physics, but another thing on top of that, that is essential for consciousness, for what we talk about as seeing and hearing, but it doesn't change how anything moves in the world. It doesn't change any neural firings, doesn't change any electrons swerving from their otherwise electronic paths. And the problem, and for me, the resistance I have to that view is something like this, but doesn't the fact that, like, your name tag on the screen looks red to me doesn't that like cause me to free associate to tomatoes and strawberries and certain wooden toys my kid has? Doesn't it make me think of the word red, believe that the tag was red, remember that it was red? Those are all dependent on neural process changes. I've never seen anybody give, to my mind, a very convincing answer. And I've never seen David Chalmers give a long answer to that question. I've seen him like briefly grapple with it and then punt. But it strikes me as concerning for the view that it seems like central stuff in our consciousness, like our experience of colors, causally influences what we believe and what we remember and what we free associate to. And if it does, it has to be part of the causal order. It can't be like a separate from the causal order. And if I had to say, oh, sorry, that's an illusion, that would change my thinking about the mind too. I think there are stakes.
When people say, I don't know, like when like we have people like Sam, I mean, I don't know a lot of professional philosophers that are so unabashedly say that like, oh, it's all free will is an illusion. You're an illusion. But when I hear people like Sam Harris, who is a brilliant neuroscientist, say stuff like that, I really don't know what they. I mean, I don't know what they mean. I guess when they say, I mean, I guess like there is this sense of like this seems to be the case that I'm in control of my actions, but I don't know. As far as, are you familiar with Bill Ramey's work or not?
I've heard him give a talk, which was awesome. And I've read like a couple of papers, but not deeply familiar.
Okay. I think his dualism just really centers on the distinction between first person and third person. That's essential. I mean, he has a lot of other considerations, but he just does not. I think the way that he does it is that, well, if we consider the naturalism as to be is the view that like everything is in principle something that could be studied by the natural sciences or could be approached that way, then if our points of view are that way, then that seems to eliminate the first person point of view, and he wants to retain that or something like that. But he has anyways, I'm somewhat persuaded. I think it's in a lot of his arguments are in his book Self-Knowledge and Resentment. But I think he's kind of moved off from the philosophy of mind and now doing a lot of what you do with the moral psychology stuff, and so I'm very interested what he has to say about that. But I kind of follow him in a lot of the mind stuff and very much inspired by him. But someone wanted to be asked because I go around talking about it, and as well as others in this community. But if you had any, you could say something to that if you wanted. But
can I take a sec to say one thing if it's not going to stretch anybody's patience too much? Here's like a thing that a lot of philosophers like to say, and some linguists I think would be happy saying it too. Like if you take a word, there's like what the word is about, and then there's the word itself. So like lots of people who speak different languages talk about trees. So what their words are about are trees, but then they have different words for trees. So suppose that you had a mental structure. You can say, well, what is the mental structure about? Maybe it's like my thought about trees or my visual experience of trees. And then you could also say, what is the counterpart to not the aboutness, but the word-likeness? Some people call that syntax, or some people call it the first dimension of two-dimensional semantics, or sense, or mode of presentation, something like that for mental stuff. Some people call it narrow content. You can say, well, that is like something, that's the way that external thing, like the tree, is presented in the representational medium that I have for representing stuff, for having thoughts about things. And that representational medium is what makes up me. Like, it is my first personal take on the world. It's like my own inner language for thinking about the world and for presenting the world to myself visually or auditorily. It is like that, just in the sense that it has the stuff that it's about, and then it also has how that aboutness hooks up with my ability to think and remember and imagine and visualize and associate. And those two features are both real features, but one is really first personal and the other one is third personal. But the one that's first personal is still subject to examination. Like, you can still find out what language a group of people speak, and you can look inside a computer and figure out what kind of operating system it's using, what kind of fundamental language everything is written in. Is it an 8-bit machine? Is it a 16-bit machine? Right? Those are like fundamental differences, not in what the programs are about, but in how they present to themselves the things that they are about. How we present to ourselves, how our minds present to ourselves, the things that our minds are about, that can be very deeply first personal and yet just as open to study as it is for computers or for languages. So I feel like I'm half on board with Bill Grammy's sentiment, but off before the conclusion that that there's a fundamental difference in kind here.
Yes, definitely. You give me a lot to think about. I think that also he thinks desires or beliefs. Well, I know that we're running out of time, but I have a question about this now that I was reminded I'm glad I reminded myself to think about it. But he thinks that for what it means to say I desire X is the belief that X is desirable. I think that's his account of desire. And I think why I asked you a long time ago about what do you think beliefs or desires, but I think that plays a lot into his metaphysics there. But you've given me something to think about for sure. But did you want to? Why don't?
Let's not chase down that rabbit hole too far, or people.
Yeah, right.
Tired listening
to you all night about that, but yeah. Maybe give your final thoughts about that, and then let's get into some of you've written 2 books. We'll talk about those very briefly. I will link all of your website, your Google pages, as well as any links to Amazon. And if someone wanted to purchase your book, I purchased your book. I had to get the PDF first, but and I'm definitely going to read it because there's just a lot of themes that I love in the book, and I've shared with my friends. So I'll put that link in the description. But yeah, if you wanted to go ahead and finalize what we were talking about and maybe get into some of the work that you're doing that we can promote.
We should, I guess, my fundamental response to somebody who thinks that desiring is conceptualizing something as desirable is to think, I don't see any reason to think about like dogs and cats or ravens or owls as conceptualizing things as desirable. That's just like a crazy level of abstraction to attribute to them. But I think they want all kinds of things, including some things that are pretty sophisticated, not just like food and breathable air and enough salt, but social things for lots of those animals to be the boss of the group. It's something that lots of dogs want, and some dogs distinctively don't. To play, something that dogs want to do, cats want to do. They have lots of interesting things that they want. They really want them. They don't have the concept of desirability. That's not like a profound argument, but that's like my gut starting point. That's the way I think about the world.
I'm kind of right there with you in terms of the intuition with animal minds, but yeah. Did you want to get into? Okay, so you have 2 publications, right?
Yeah. Do you want to hear about the books a little tiny bit, or
yes, that'd be great, and then we can end on that note.
Yeah. So I wrote a book called Three Faces of Desire. That's really interdisciplinary work with a bunch of psych and neuroscience in it, a lot for a philosophical work. And I tried to interpret the brain's dopamine system in that book. And the way I end up interpreting it is that it's a reward system, which also means that it's the system that constitutes the facts about our desires. So wanting something is it counting as a desire, counting as a reward in the reward learning sense. And that argument I just make over that book. Like I kind of hinted before, that position is hinted at in like a 20-page chapter from Fred Dresky's book, Explaining Behavior from 1988. And it's like, I didn't even remember that I had read the chapter. And then I was like halfway through writing the book and I was like, wait a minute, am I just redoing Fred's book? In a way, kind of. But also, I was really lucky to start that book exactly when I did, because research on the brain's dopamine system exploded around 1990. And it was really only around 2000 that enough was known to even tentatively reach the conclusions that I reached. And I finished that book in 2004. So I feel like I had good timing to be asking my questions at exactly the right moment in scientific history. Since then, a bunch of other philosophers have written about the dopamine system in various ways. And lots of them have great opinions. Most of them disagree with me, but that's my take. I say some stuff about pleasure and some stuff about motivation and about the general nature of desire. And then a few years after that, I wrote this book with my friend Nomi, and it's called In Praise of Desire. And that's a work in moral psychology. So it's not very sciencey. It has one sciencey chapter where we do a little bit of this sciencey stuff on desire. And so that kind of compresses some of the themes from the first book into a chapter. But other than that, it's very straightforwardly a work in moral psychology. It asks, what is it to act for a reason or believe for a reason? And it defends a positive theory. And it talks about the nature of deliberation and how deliberation isn't the way that we can believe things for reasons or act for reasons, but a tool for using our pre-existing capacity. It's a way of using pre-existing capacities to act and believe for reasons to our benefit. It discusses love, pleasure, virtue, psychological virtues, whether there's something morally vicious about a person who enjoys video games where you shoot human bodies and they splatter everywhere. Talks about what it is to have goodwill or ill will toward another person and to act on it. And then it wraps up with a chapter on inner struggle and a chapter on addiction, just like we were talking about here.
Awesome. And what if someone heard this stream and then, oh man, I'm really interested in these topics. I don't know anything about philosophy, but I really like this philosophy of mind stuff that y'all are talking about. I want to know more about it. What sort of beginner book might you recommend for them?
Yeah. If you're interested in consciousness or the mind, I would pick either Dan Dennett's book from 1991, Consciousness is Explained, which might feel old at this point, but it's so great and it's so interdisciplinary. And when you read it, you get so excited. And sometimes you read about psych phenomena that you've never heard before, and the hair will just stand up on the back of your neck. Like, holy shit, how is that even possible? Human beings are nuts. And Dennett is both very deep and very accessible. The only thing that I think he does badly in that whole book is write about other professional philosophers, and it's clear that he does because he doesn't care. Like, he feels like he has a professional obligation to have a section towards the back where he talks about what professional philosophers have said. But most of the time, he's just doing his thing, broadly interdisciplinary, richly interesting and amazing, totally readable by somebody who's in the middle of college and has never taken philosophy.
Awesome.
And then if you're in the middle of high school rather than the middle of college, I would say Gödel Escher Bach, the much loved, even older book from Douglas Hofstadter, which weaves together M.C. Escher, the guy who draws, Penrose triangle staircases and weird creatures rolling up and down them, uh, uh, Kurt Gödel, the 20th century mathematician, with some of the most important results about the nature of arithmetic in the history of math. And Bach, Johann Sebastian Bach, the late Baroque musician, composer, and organist. And you're like, how does that have anything to do with the mind? When I read that book in high school, I just couldn't have been like more fascinated or more excited to like understand more deeply everything that I was seeing. It was so exciting. So that would be my pick.
Awesome. And one last question. Who's your favorite philosopher, or you can give up to 3?
Let me pick 2. Let me pick Fred Dresky. He just shaped me so totally. He had a reputation back in his days at the University of Wisconsin, where he was for a lot of his career, as a mean guy, the icy commander, they called him. And he earned it, from what I'm told. But also, his first marriage ended, and he remarried. And around the time that happened, he became a total sweetheart, which probably was not totally coincidental. And that's when I knew him. And he couldn't have been like more intellectually generous or supportive. He once or twice like gave me just like the gentlest smack down when I really needed it to become a better person and a better philosopher. And almost all of the time just like gave me support and encouragement and his time. And he's so freaking clear and so deep. And you read like a 160-page book, and they're not even big pages, like explaining behavior. You know, like this just like blew open like 3 different fields of inquiry, and it's amazing. And even if you disagree, and you should, because you should disagree with every philosopher, because how the heck did anybody get it right so far? I don't know. This doesn't seem likely. But even when you disagree, like you can put your finger on exactly the sentence where you disagree and exactly why. He's so lucid. And then the other person, so much harder, but I came to have so much affection for as an intellectual, and I wish I knew her as a person, is Ruth Millikan. She's the author of a 1984 book, Language, Thought, and Other Biological Categories. The story I heard is that she wrote it basically after she finished raising her kids and had sent them to college. And it's like her first major philosophical work. And it's just brain-breakingly brilliant. And it's also super uncompromising. Like I've never yet read a paper that talks about functions through natural selection. The idea that like the function of the heart is to pump blood because of its history of natural selection. I've never yet read a paper that criticized Millikan's theory on that got all of Millikan's theory right. Like she is so deep and so thorough, and she's also, however, totally unsympathetic to you if you're not as smart. So like she has a book on the mind and language, and it starts with about 80 pages on biological functions, and you don't really know why, and you don't know what any of this stuff, how any of this stuff is going to pay off psychologically. And she's just like, I'll get there. Remember, everything I tell you in these 80 pages, I'm going to be using it. And she does. She is so smart. And I just am constantly trying to learn the other lessons, the ones that I accept as an adult intellectual and don't just have imprinted on me as a baby duckling, that I can from that work. Her later stuff is great too, but like if I had to choose, I would just keep going back to Language, Thought, and Other Biological Categories until I learned everything I could from it, at which point I would happily die. It's that great.
Well, that's just more stuff to put in the description. Then I'll have to put some of the bios there. But let me know also if there's anything that you want me to put in the description, things you would recommend other than the things that you've spoken of. But I deeply appreciate your time here. It's been great. We've covered a lot. Philosophy.
Thanks for having me here. It was fun.
No problem. No problem. It's a ginormous topic, but we did pretty good, just under 2 hours. So I appreciate the viewers. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe. It is a rather new channel since I think it started in January. we had Stephen Law, now we have Dr. Schroeder, and we have another Timothy coming in, Dr. Stratton. And on Tuesday, he's a theologian, Christian apologist kind of person, and that focuses on Molinism. And so I'll be talking to him about those views. And so I appreciate everyone here. Thank you. Y'all have a good one.
Thanks. Bye.